I spent 12 years caring for a gentleman in the United States. I was working as a caregiver, and after so long at his side, he felt like family to me, preparing his medicines, serving his lunch, listening to his stories, keeping him company. 12 years of setting my own life aside to be present in someone else's. And when he passed, I thought the ground would give way beneath me. I was 55 years old, alone in a foreign country, with no clear sense of what would come next. I had left India with a small suitcase and a heart split in two, and now that man, the only thread that tied me to that house, that routine, that country, was gone forever. But then his children called me to sit with them in the living room. What they told me that day changed everything. Not just my financial situation, not just my plans. It changed the way I understand what it truly means to care for someone, what it means to be seen, what it means that a life devoted to another can come back to you in ways you never could have imagined. This is my story, and it only happened because one day, 12 years ago, an old man with blue eyes told me he hoped I liked coffee. There are moments in life you cannot put into words. Moments when the ground disappears from beneath your feet, not from pain, but from something far greater, from a gratitude so deep it aches in your chest. I lived one of those moments, and it made me cry for hours, on my knees in the room where I had spent so many years of my life, holding in my hands the weight of everything I had built far from home. But he, even after leaving, still managed to surprise me in a way I never could have anticipated. This is my story. It is not an easy story. It is not a story of luck. It is a story of choices, of sacrifices, of silent love, and of a promise life made to me when I had already stopped waiting for it. My name is Shanti. I am 55 years old. I am Indian. And for more than a decade, my home was a house in the American heartland, beside an elderly man named Harold. When I arrived in the United States, I did not know exactly what to expect. I was 43 years old at the time, and life had already taught me that things rarely go as planned. I had left behind everything I knew. My city, the familiar smells of morning, the sounds of streets I had known since childhood, the faces of the people I loved. I left all of that behind with a small suitcase, a reasonable command of English, and a heart divided in two. Need is a cruel teacher, but an efficient one. It does not ask if you are ready. It simply pushes you forward. I came to work as a caregiver. It was a field I already knew well. Back in India, I had cared for my own mother during the last years of her life. That experience had taught me more than any training course ever could. It had taught me about patience, about presence, about the value of simply being there beside someone who needs you. And it was with exactly that background that I arrived at Harold's home. I still remember the first day as though it were yesterday. It was an October morning, the air cold in a way I was not yet accustomed to, and the leaves on the trees had those autumn colors you see in American photographs: yellow, orange, red, everything very beautiful, everything very different from anything I had ever known. The house was large by the standards I had grown up with, a simple but well-kept home, with a garden in front and a back porch from which you could see a wide stretch of sky. Later, I would spend so many evenings on that porch. Harold was sitting in the armchair in the living room when I first walked in. He was 81 years old that day, his hair completely white, his eyes a very pale blue, the posture of someone who had been strong all his life, but whom time was gradually bending. He looked at me with that direct manner I would come to recognize as his nature, without malice, without pretense, simply curious. He said something simple. He said he hoped I liked coffee because he drank at least 4 cups a day and had no intention of stopping for any doctor. I laughed. He laughed too. And that is how it began. The first months were a period of adjustment, not only to him, but to everything, to the language in its more everyday nuances, the expressions, the jokes that took me a beat longer to understand, to the food, the climate, the particular loneliness of someone far from home without knowing when they will return. There were nights when I lay in my bed in the small room at the back of the house, listening to an American silence so different from the silence I knew, and I wondered whether I had made the right choice. But in the morning, I would get up, brew the coffee, and Harold would be there, always with something to say, a story from the past, an opinion about the news, a good-natured complaint about the knee that ached when rain was coming. He was the sort of person who fills the space around him without effort, not in a loud way, but in a way that makes silence feel less empty. Little by little, I learned about his life. Harold had worked as an engineer for more than 30 years. He had married young, a woman named Dorothy, whom he called Dot, who had died some years before I arrived. He had 2 grown children, Robert and Susan, who lived in other cities and visited a few times a year. The house was full of photographs of them, and I learned to recognize each stage of the children who had grown up and become adults, and then gone off to live their own lives. I had seen this many times in my work as a caregiver. Children who love, but who are busy, who call, who send messages, who show up at Christmas and on birthdays, who are not bad children, but who are simply living their own lives while a father or mother grows older in the same rooms as always. I did not judge. I understood. Life is like that. People do what they can, but I was there, every day, and that made a difference I would only come to fully understand much later. As time passed, Harold and I developed a routine that was almost like a language of its own. He knew I needed about 10 minutes of quiet after waking before I could properly hold a conversation. I knew he disliked it when I oversalted the food, and that he became grumpy when the baseball team he followed lost. He knew that on Thursday evenings I called my family in India, and that afterwards I would go a little quiet. I knew that when he was very silent during dinner, it was because he was missing Dorothy. These were small things, but it is the small things that build a life together. He taught me English without realizing it. Using expressions I would write down in a little notebook I still keep. I taught him words in Hindi, which he would repeat with that heavy, mangled accent that made me dissolve into laughter, and he would laugh along without any wounded pride. Once he tried to repeat an entire sentence I had said, and what came out was so utterly nonsensical that we both ended up with tears streaming down our faces. That night, I went to sleep with a light heart. It was moments like those that made everything possible. That made the distance from my homeland bearable. But time passes, and with elderly people, time passes in a way you feel at every stage. Harold moved through 85, 86, 87. A health that was already fragile began giving way gradually, like a structure that cracks slowly before it finally yields. The one knee that ached became 2 knees. The memory that sometimes failed began failing more often. The medicines increased. The medical appointments became more regular. The nights grew longer. I was there through every one of those stages. When he needed help getting out of bed, I was there. When he was frightened one night, waking without knowing where he was, his heart racing, I held his hand and stayed there speaking softly until he calmed. When he wept in frustration because his body no longer obeyed him the way he wanted, I did not tell him everything was fine, because it was not, but I told him he was not alone. I never said that as a beautiful phrase. I said it because it was true. I never knew exactly what Harold felt for me. He was not a man of excessive words. He was not the sort to be constantly declaring affection. But there was something in the way he looked at me, a trust with which he allowed me to care for him in his most vulnerable moments that told me more than any words could have, and I learned to receive that as the gift it was. When I look back today on those 12 years, I do not see only work. I see a life that happened, a life that was not in my original plans, but that was real, intense, and full of meaning. I did not know, when I arrived at that house on that cold October morning, that I was beginning something that would change me in ways I could not yet imagine. I did not know that that man with blue eyes and strong opinions about coffee would become one of the most important people in my life, and I did not know that, even after leaving, he would still have one last surprise for me. There is something about caring for someone that no one tells you before you begin. It is not the physical exhaustion, though that is real and heavy. It is not the homesickness, though that too is always present like a background ache you learn to live with. The thing no one tells you is this. When you care for someone with genuine dedication, you begin to measure time differently. You stop counting the years by your own life and begin counting them by the life of the person beside you. And when that person goes, you feel that a part of your own time has gone with them. I began to notice this around the 5th year with Harold. I was 48, and he was 86, And it was during that period that things truly began to change. Not all at once. It is never all at once. It is always gradual, always in those small losses you barely notice day to day, but which, when you look back, you realize were immense. The first more serious sign was his memory. Harold had always had a very sharp mind. He was the sort who remembered dates, names, details of conversations that had taken place years before. He enjoyed crossword puzzles, chess, debating politics with a clarity that impressed me. So when he began repeating the same stories twice in the same afternoon, I noticed. I said nothing at first. I did not want to make him feel bad, but I noticed. Then came the nighttime confusion. Some nights he would wake, not quite knowing where he was, calling out for Dorothy in a voice that broke my heart, because in those moments he was not confused by illness. He was simply missing her in a way his mind had found to express what his heart was feeling. I would sit there at the edge of the bed, holding his hand until his eyes settled back into reality. Afterwards, he always felt a little ashamed. Harold was a proud man, the kind who did not like to show weakness. And I always did the same thing in those moments. I pretended it had been nothing much. I said I would fetch some water, left for a few minutes, came back with the glass, and changed the subject. He knew I was doing it on purpose. I knew that he knew, and neither of us needed to speak about it. That was one of the silent languages we had built together. Harold's children, Robert and Susan, came to visit with a frequency that shifted with what their own lives allowed. Robert lived about 6 hours away and had a company to run, a wife, 3 children. Susan lived somewhat closer, but had her own health troubles that she rarely mentioned, though I could see them in the way she moved and in the tiredness she carried in her face. They were good people. I need to make that clear, because it would be easy to cast them as the villains of this story. And they were not. They loved their father. It is just that loving from a distance is different from loving up close. Loving from a distance is calling on Wednesdays and on birthdays and showing up at Christmas. Loving up close is waking at 3 a.m. because someone is frightened in the dark. I did the second kind. There was no resentment in that. I needed there not to be, because resentment is a weight you carry alone, and that serves no purpose. So I chose to see it this way. I was doing what I knew how to do, in the way I knew how to do it, and that had value in itself, regardless of who else was or was not present. But of course there were difficult moments. There were nights when I was exhausted in a way that goes beyond the physical, that tiredness that settles into the soul. And I would think of India, think of my sister, think of my niece who had grown up while I was away, and I would feel that familiar ache of someone who always carries a part of themselves in another corner of the world. In those moments, I would go to the back porch. I would stand there listening to the American silence, looking at the stretch of sky that always seemed vast from that angle, and I would breathe deeply. And then I would go back inside, because there was someone who needed me. It was around Harold's 88th year that the doctors began using more serious words. Congestive heart failure. Not the kind that kills suddenly, but the slow kind, which gradually reduces the heart's capacity, like a candle that grows smaller before it finally goes out. The medicines increased. The dietary restrictions became stricter. He began needing help with things he had previously done without thinking. I remember the first time I needed to help him in a more intimate way, with one of those basic bodily needs one never imagines requiring assistance. He was silent for a long moment afterwards. I continued doing what needed to be done, with the same calm with which I did everything, without ceremony, without allowing the moment to become heavier than necessary. When I finished, he said, in that voice that had grown hoarser with the years, that he did not know if he was capable of thanking me for that. I told him there was no need to thank me, that it was what I was there to do. He was quiet for a while longer. Then he said something I have never forgotten. He said he had spent his entire life taking pride in being self-sufficient, that he had built his career alone, raised his children, kept up the house, faced everything life had brought him, and that it was very strange, this phase, learning to accept help without feeling he was losing something of himself. I thought about that for many days, about how we are taught throughout life to give and never to receive, about how asking for help is treated as weakness when it actually requires enormous courage, about how allowing another person to see you in your limitations is an act of trust that very few people can truly offer. Harold was teaching me things without realizing it. He always had been. The following years were a series of ups and downs. There were periods when he improved a little, gained some energy, became more animated, and in those moments the house felt lighter. He would tell more stories. We would spend longer on the porch talking about everything and nothing. And there were periods when he worsened, became quieter, slept more, and I learned to respect his rhythm without trying to force anything. During one of those better phases, he asked me to sit in the chair beside his armchair. It was an afternoon with sunlight coming through the living room window, and he had that clearer look that appeared on his better days. He asked me about India, not in a superficial way, the way people ask simply to have something to say. He asked genuinely. He wanted to know about my city, about what my childhood was like, about my family, about what I missed. And I told him. I told him about my city, with its noisy, colorful streets, about my mother, who had been gone for so many years, but whom I still felt as a presence, about my younger sister Priya, who had stayed in India and whom I saw on video calls every week, but which was different from being near, about the smells I missed, the smell of street food, the smell of earth after the monsoon rains, the particular smell of the house where I grew up that I can still sense in my memory when I close my eyes. Harold listened to everything, without interrupting, with that complete attention that was characteristic of him when things truly mattered. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had never really left the United States much, that he had traveled a few times but had never truly understood what it means to leave the country where you were born and live in another, and that listening to me, he was beginning to understand a little more. He said I was more courageous than I realized. I did not know what to say, so I said nothing. But those words stayed with me. There was a photograph in the living room that I looked at almost every day. It was a picture of Harold as a young man. He must have been in his early 30s, with Dorothy beside him, both of them smiling in that way that only exists when you are still in the middle of life and do not yet know how short it will be. He was in a suit, she in a light dress, and there was a lightness to them both that moved me every time I saw it. One time he caught me looking at that photograph and came over slowly with the walker he had begun using. He stood beside me in silence for a while. Then he said Dorothy would have liked me, that she was the kind of person who judged people by their heart, not by their origin, and that she would have seen right away that I had the kind of heart she respected. I could not hold back the tears that time. He pretended not to see. That was how Harold and I loved each other, without making noise, without needing grand gestures, with warm tea and afternoon stories and silences that did not need filling. And I still did not know that he was quietly preparing one last thing for me. There is a moment when you know. Not because someone has told you, not because some doctor has used some definitive word, but because you have spent years beside a person and learned to read them the way you read a book you know by heart. You know it by the way they breathe, by the way they look out the window, by the way they stop complaining about the small things, because small things cease to matter when something larger is approaching. I knew in the winter of the 11th year, Harold was 91, and there was something different about him during that period, a stillness that was not the usual silence, but something deeper, older, as though a part of him had already begun quietly taking leave of things. I did not tell the children immediately, not because I wanted to hide it, but because I did not yet have words for it. It was a perception that lived in the body before it lived in the mind, and I was still trying to understand what I was feeling before I could try to explain it to anyone. But I knew. The winter that year was especially cold, that kind of American cold that gets into your bones and that I had never learned to love completely, even after so many years. The house was kept warm. Harold liked the temperature high because he felt cold easily, and sometimes I needed to step out into the garden for a few minutes just to breathe fresh air, even if that air made me shiver. Harold was sleeping more, much more. There were days when he would wake for meals, take his medicines, exchange a few words with me, and go back to sleep. Sometimes I would sit in a corner of his room, doing some small task, embroidery or reading, just to be present while he rested. Not because he had asked me to, but because I could not stay away. When he woke and found me there, he never asked why I was in the room. He would simply look at me for a moment with that time-faded blue gaze, and sometimes smile a little, and close his eyes again. That was enough. It was on an afternoon in February that he asked me to sit beside him, in a different way. Not the casual way of always, the way of someone who wants company while watching the news or telling a story. It was more deliberate. He patted the arm of the chair beside his and waited for me to sit. I sat down. I stayed quiet, waiting. He looked out the window for a while. Outside, snow had accumulated in the garden, and the sky was that heavy gray of winter. Then he turned to me and said, in that voice that had grown quieter and slower with the years, that he wanted to thank me for something. I told him he did not need to thank me for anything. He made a gesture with his hand, that gesture of his when he wanted to finish speaking without being interrupted. So I stayed quiet. He said that in all his life, he had learned that the people who truly matter are those who stay, not those who appear in the good moments, not those who make grand promises, but those who stay when things get hard, when things get ugly, when there is nothing glamorous or easy left about being present. He said I was that kind of person, and that he had been very fortunate. I felt the tears rising, but I held them back. I held them because he was telling me this with a serenity that called for seriousness, not tears. So I breathed deeply and said that the fortune had been mine as well, that I had learned more from him than he realized. He asked what I had learned, and I thought for a genuine moment before answering. I said I had learned that aging with dignity is a form of courage, that I had learned that love does not need great words to be real, that I had learned that it is possible to make a home anywhere in the world, as long as there is someone who truly sees you. He was quiet after that, but there was something in his expression that I read as satisfaction, like someone who has heard exactly what they needed to hear. I called Robert that week. I told him, carefully but clearly, that I thought it would be good if he and Susan came to visit their father soon. I did not use dramatic words. I did not need to. Robert understood from the tone of my voice. There was a silence on the other end of the line, the kind of silence in which a person is processing information they already knew but had not yet allowed themselves to fully accept. Then he said they would come the following weekend. Both of them came, Robert with his wife, Susan alone. The house filled in a way it had not for a long time, with different voices, with the smell of food I prepared in larger quantities, with that strange energy of a family gathering that is at once joyful and heavy, because everyone knows, even without saying it, that time is passing too quickly. Harold became more animated during those days. It was visible. There was an energy that appeared in him when his children were around, a slightly more upright version of himself, as though the body found some hidden reserve of vitality because of their presence. I watched this with warmth and with a pang of something that was not jealousy, but resembled it, not jealousy of the children, a sadness for the time they had lost, without knowing how much they would lose. But I was no one to judge how people love. Everyone loves within their own limitations and possibilities. I knew that. On one of the evenings of that visit, I was in the kitchen tidying up after dinner when Susan came in. She picked up a tea towel and began helping me dry the dishes without saying anything. We stood there side by side, in silence for a while. Then she said, without looking at me, that she knew I had cared for her father in a way they had not been able to, and that she did not quite know how to thank me for that. I said there was nothing to thank me for, that I had done it because I wanted to, because Harold deserved it, because it was what I knew how to do. She was quiet a while longer. Then she said her father mentioned me every time she called, always with a kind of affection that he rarely showed towards anyone outside the immediate family. She said that the last time she had visited, months earlier, he had told her that Shanti was the most reliable person he knew, that she had never let him down. I needed to look down at that moment, at my hands, at the dishes, at anything that was not her face, because I felt the tears coming in a way I would not have been able to hold back if I had met her eyes. She never lets him down. Those were simple words, but they carried 12 years of sleepless nights, of counted medicines, of hands held in the dark, of stories listened to for the 1,000th time with the same attention as the first. They carried all that I had left behind in order to be there. Robert and Susan stayed for a week. When they left, Harold became quieter than usual. It was not sadness exactly. It was more a kind of gathering inward, as though he were arranging internal things to which I had no access. I respected that space. I continued doing everything that needed doing, without trying to force conversation, without trying to artificially lift his spirits. There was an afternoon when he asked me to bring down a box from the wardrobe in his bedroom. It was a dark wooden box with a small lock he opened with a key kept on a cord with his other keys. Inside were papers, old photographs, some letters. He took things out slowly, looking at each one for a moment before moving to the next. I stood near the door, not sure whether I should leave, but he made no gesture to dismiss me, so I stayed. In one of the photographs he was very young, perhaps in his early 20s, in military uniform. I had not known he had served in the army. He had never mentioned it. He saw the surprise on my face and said that there were things it had taken him a lifetime to learn to speak about, that the time he had spent in military service had been the most difficult period of his life, and that for many years he had simply kept it in a box, literally and figuratively. I said I understood that everyone has a box like that. He looked at me for a moment as though assessing whether I truly understood. Then he nodded, as one who agrees, and continued leafing through the papers. At the end, he took a white envelope from the box. He held it for a while without saying anything. Then he put it back, closed the box, and asked me to return it to the wardrobe. I asked no questions. It was not in my nature to ask questions at moments when people are in something that belongs to them. But that envelope stayed in my mind for a long time. The weeks that followed moved with a slowness that had its own weight. Harold left his room less, ate less, spoke less. There were days when the only thing he wanted was for me to be nearby without needing to do anything specific. I stayed. I brought my handwork to his room, sat in a corner, and that was enough. One night, very late, he called me. I was nearly asleep when I heard my name. Not loud, almost a whisper, but I woke immediately with that ability caregivers develop of being ready even in sleep. I went to his room. He was awake, looking at the ceiling. I asked if he was all right, if he was in pain. He said no. He said he was just thinking. I asked what about. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he was thinking that he had had a good life, that he had loved well, that he had worked with honor, that he had done what he could with what he had, and that he was at peace with that. I said nothing. I simply took his hand and sat there at the edge of his bed until he fell asleep again. When I returned to my room, I cried quietly into the pillow because I knew what those words meant. They were the words of someone preparing to go. No one is ready. It does not matter how much time you had to prepare. It does not matter how many times you rehearsed that moment in your mind, trying to build an inner armor for when it came. When it truly comes, you realize the armor never existed, that you were only postponing the moment of feeling. Harold died on a morning in April. The air outside was already a little warmer, that first warmth of spring that makes people open their windows and breathe deeply as though the world were beginning again. There were birds. I remember the birds because his room had a window overlooking the garden, and that morning the birds were singing in a way that seemed exaggerated, almost theatrical, as though nature did not know what was happening inside the house. He went in his sleep, peacefully, with no apparent pain. With that face I had learned to know in every expression, every mood, every version time had sculpted over the years, resting in a way I had rarely seen during his life. I had entered the room at 6:30 in the morning, as every day, to see how he had spent the night, and I knew immediately, before drawing close, before touching his hand, to feel what I knew I would feel. I knew by the different silence in the room, that kind of silence which is not merely the absence of sound, but the absence of presence. I stood in the doorway for a moment whose length I cannot say. There are things the body does by itself when the mind is still processing. I called the doctor. I called Robert. My voice was calm, strangely calm, the calm of someone operating on automatic, because if she stops to feel, she will not be able to do what needs to be done. Robert answered on the third ring, his voice still thick with sleep, and when I told him what had happened, there was a silence on the other end that lasted several seconds. Then he said he was on his way. I said yes, that I would take care of everything until he arrived, and I did. Because it was what I knew how to do. Because 12 years had taught me that in the hardest moments, when everything in you wants to stop, sit on the floor and not move again, you breathe deeply and do what needs to be done. Not because you are not feeling, but because feeling and functioning sometimes have to happen in parallel. I called Susan shortly after. The conversation was shorter, harder. She began to cry during the call. That restrained crying of someone who is trying not to cry, but cannot manage it. I waited. I let her cry. I told her I was all right, that Harold had gone in peace, that he had not suffered. These were true things. And sometimes the truth, even when it hurts, is a gift. Robert arrived that afternoon with his wife. Susan arrived the next day. The house that had been my home for 12 years was suddenly full of a different kind of activity. Phone calls, people coming and going, voices in low tones about arrangements, documents, the things that need to be attended to when someone departs and leaves behind a whole life of concrete things that need to be put in order. I moved through all of this like someone who knows every centimeter of that space, but who suddenly is not sure of the place they occupy within it. Because this is a reality caregivers rarely speak of, but which all of them feel. When the person you cared for goes away, you are left in a kind of limbo. Your role has ended. Your purpose in that place, at least the immediate concrete purpose, has disappeared along with the person. And you, who were so accustomed to being needed, suddenly do not know what to do with your own hands. I continued doing what I knew. I prepared food. I kept the house in order. I offered coffee when people needed something to hold between their hands while they tried to process their grief. They were small gestures, but they were what I had to give in that moment. The service was simple, as Harold would have wanted. He had never liked excess. He was the kind of person who used to say that too much ceremony is for those who need to convince others of something, and that whoever has lived well needs no great fuss at the end. There were few people, old friends, some neighbors, some former colleagues from decades past who were still alive and had been able to come, and the family. I stood in a corner watching. I did not feel part of the family in the formal sense, but I did not feel a stranger either. It was something in between, that nameless position caregivers occupy, too present to be merely a professional, and not exactly family by blood or by paper. Several people came to speak with me. People Harold had mentioned over the years, names I knew, but faces I was seeing for the first time. Many said Harold spoke of me, that he mentioned my name with a kind of confidence and warmth that they had rarely heard from him about anyone outside his immediate family. Each time someone said that, I felt a tightening in my chest that was equal parts pain and gratitude, mixed in a way that had no name. 3 days of much activity passed before things began to settle. Robert and Susan stayed at the house to handle the legal matters, the documents, the estate, the questions that arise when someone departs and leaves behind a lifetime of concrete things that need to be organized. I stayed on during that period, not knowing exactly what to do with the situation, whether I should begin packing my things, whether I should start looking for another job, whether I should finally think about returning to India. These were thoughts I had kept on a back burner for so long that now, with the foreground emptied, they all came at once. I had saved over the years, not a fortune, but a reasonable amount, the fruit of years of honest work and a simple life without large expenses beyond the necessary. There was also an account I kept in India, money I sent regularly to help my sister, of which I had managed to save a portion. It was enough to return with some dignity, but not enough to return with the peace of mind I had dreamed of. I was 55 years old, not old, but not young either, and the idea of returning to India and having to start from scratch at that age filled me with an anxiety I tried to manage, but which was always there. It was on an afternoon of the 4th day that Robert asked me to sit in the living room. Susan was seated on the sofa, her hands in her lap, with an expression I could not quite read. Robert was in the armchair that had been Harold's, which gave me an immediate physical jolt, seeing someone else in that place. But it was the most comfortable chair in the room, and I understood. They wore serious expressions, but not tense. It was more the seriousness of people who are about to say something important and are choosing their words with care. Robert began. He said they had been with the family solicitor over the past few days dealing with matters relating to his father's will, and that there was something in the will that concerned me directly. I did not understand immediately. Will concerned me. The words arrived, but my mind took a moment to assemble their full meaning. He continued. He said that Harold had included my name in his will some years ago, that he had made this decision deliberately, had spoken with the solicitor, had been clear about what he wanted, and that he had left me the sum of $155,000. The room went completely silent. Or perhaps the silence was only inside me, because my mind had stopped processing anything other than that number. $155,000. I needed to ask Robert to repeat it, not because I had not heard, but because my mind simply was not accepting that information as real. It was the kind of thing that happens in stories you hear about, not in your own life. Not in the life of a 55-year-old woman who had spent 12 years counting out medicines and washing dishes and holding hands in the dark. Robert repeated it, with the same clarity, the same number. And he added that his father had left a letter along with the instruction in the will. A letter for me. Susan stood and went to fetch the envelope. When she returned and held out that white envelope to me, I recognized it immediately. It was the same envelope Harold had taken from the wooden box that afternoon months before. The same one he had held for a time before putting back. I had been carrying that envelope in my memory without knowing what it contained, and now it was in my hands. I did not open it in front of them. I excused myself, in a voice that did not sound like mine, and went to the room that had been my home for 12 years. I sat on the bed. I looked at the envelope for a while, my hands slightly trembling, not from cold or fear, but from emotion too great for the body to contain. I opened it slowly. Harold's handwriting was that of someone who had learned to write in an era when people still took penmanship seriously. Firm, but with the subtle tremors of more recent years. It was 2 pages long. I read slowly, every word, reading some parts twice to be sure I was understanding. He wrote that he had thought at great length about what to leave me. That money was what he had to give in a concrete form, but that what he truly wanted to give me was the possibility of choice. Because in all the life he had observed in me, the thing he saw most clearly was a woman who had built her entire life in service of others, who had placed her own choices in second place, and who deserved to have a phase of her life in which she could decide what she wanted for herself. He wrote that he knew I was homesick, that he saw it in my eyes every time I came back from calls with my family, and that he hoped that money would give me the freedom to return home, or to stay, or to do whatever I wished, but that it would be my choice, not a compulsion of necessity. The last line of the letter said, "You never let me down, Shanti, and that is rarer than the world recognizes." Then I cried. I cried in a way I had not cried for a long time, that deep kind, from within, which is not only sadness and not only joy, but the meeting of both things at a point in the chest where all the things you lived with too much intensity to process at the time are kept. I cried for Harold, who had gone, for the time we had spent together, for the stories I would never hear again, for the coffee he drank in 4 cups a day without asking any doctor's permission, for the silences shared on the porch, for the laughter over his mangled Hindi words, for everything that had been real and that now lived only in memory. And I cried from gratitude, a gratitude so vast it ached, for a man who even after departing had thought of me, who had seen in me something worthy of care. There is a kind of transformation that does not happen suddenly, that has no exact moment, no precise instant you can point to and say, here. It was in this second that everything changed. Most real transformations in life are slow, cumulative, built layer upon layer over so much time that when you finally notice how much you have changed, it is already impossible to separate who you were from who you have become. But there are also those moments when something shifts so clearly, so concretely, that you know exactly where to place the milestone. That afternoon in the living room, with Robert and Susan before me and a white envelope in my hands, was one of those moments. $155,000. I was still processing that number when I returned to the living room after reading the letter. My eyes had probably still shown traces of crying, but I had washed my face and breathed deeply enough to sit down and continue the conversation. Robert and Susan looked at me with an expression that mixed respect with something that seemed like genuine relief, as though they were glad to be the bearers of that news. Robert said his father had made that decision with full awareness and clarity, that the solicitor had confirmed Harold was in complete mental soundness when he signed the document, years before his health had deteriorated more seriously, that there was no ambiguity, no possible contest, no doubt about his intention. Susan added that they fully supported it, that they understood, that they thought it more than fair. I did not know what to say, so I said the only true thing I had, that I had not done any of it expecting something in return, that I had cared for Harold because he deserved to be cared for, because he was a good person, because I had come to love him as family. Robert said he knew that, and that it was precisely why his father had done what he did. In the days that followed, as the legal formalities were set in motion, I began doing something I had not done for a long time. I began thinking about myself, not in a selfish way, but in a way that felt almost strange. So unfamiliar had it become. To sit with my own thoughts and ask, what do I want now? What makes sense for my life from here on? The answer that came was always the same. It had always been the same, kept at the back out of necessity, deferred out of responsibility, but never forgotten. I wanted to go home. It was not a decision made in the impulse of emotion. It was a decision built over 12 years of accumulated longing, of weekly calls that ended with a tightening in the chest, of dreams where I was walking the streets of my city and woke in an American room with the sad disorientation of someone who took a moment too long to remember where they were. I wanted to see my sister Priya in person, not on a small screen. I wanted to be present for the everyday things, not only for birthdays and emergencies. I wanted to feel the particular warmth of my homeland's sun, which is different from any other sun I have ever felt. I wanted to hear the sounds of the streets I had known since childhood. I wanted simply to be home. And now, for the first time in a very long time, I could. I began doing the calculations with a mixture of disbelief and emotion that made it hard to keep a clear head. $155,000. Converting to Indian rupees, it was a figure that took my breath away just to think about. It was more money than I had ever seen gathered together at any point in my life. It was more money than my family had had access to in generations, and added to what I had saved over the years, the fruit of a simple life and a financial discipline I had learned out of necessity. The total was something I was still learning to call by its right name. It was freedom. Not the abstract freedom people mention in speeches and self-help books. It was concrete, practical, real freedom. The freedom to not have to accept the next job that came along out of desperation. The freedom to return to India without arriving asking for help. The freedom to help my sister in a way I had never managed before. The freedom to, perhaps for the first time in my adult life, make choices from what I wanted, not only from what I needed. I sat with all of this for several days before beginning to make concrete decisions. There was a part of me still waiting for someone to say there had been a mistake, that it was the wrong number, that Harold had left this amount to someone else, and there had been a mix-up of names. My mind, trained by decades not to expect too much so as not to be hurt, resisted fully accepting it. But it was real, and little by little, slowly, I let that reality land. Before beginning to arrange the return, I did something I needed to do. I went out to the back garden of the house, that garden I had looked at so many mornings and evenings over 12 years, and stood there for a good while. It was a spring afternoon, the same kind as the one on which Harold had gone, with that soft light and the birds singing with that unnecessary intensity. I spoke to him, not aloud, or perhaps a little aloud, softly, to the garden and to the sky and to the air that was full of the smell of grass and of flowers he had planted with Dorothy decades ago, and which kept on growing as though they did not know that time had passed. I said I missed him, that the house felt strange without his presence filling the rooms, that I would carry his stories with me wherever I went, that I would remember the 4 cups of coffee a day, the mangled Hindi words, the silences on the porch, the way he looked at me when I said something he thought was right. I said he had given me more than money. He had given me proof that the things we do with love, even when no one is watching, even when there is no applause or immediate recognition, matter. They are seen. They are remembered. And sometimes they come back to you in ways you could never have imagined. I stayed there until the sun began to shift angle. Then I went inside and started packing my bags. The journey back to India came some weeks later. I had spent that period finalizing practical matters, signing documents, saying goodbyes, closing that chapter of my life with the care it deserved. Robert and Susan were kind until the very end. There was a dinner on the last night when the 3 of us sat together at that table that had been the setting for so many meals over the years, and it was a strange and beautiful evening, full of stories about Harold that made us laugh and cry in turns. When it was time to go, Susan embraced me for a long while. She said her father had chosen well. I told her that she and her brother had also been good children, each in the way they knew how to be, and I saw in her eyes that this had meant something. Robert drove me to the airport. Along the way, we were silent for most of the journey. The silence of people who have already said everything they needed to say and are now simply together in the space that remains before the farewell. At the departure gate, he extended his hand and then changed his mind and hugged me, briefly, a little awkwardly, the way of men who are not used to showing affection but are trying. I boarded the plane with a larger suitcase than the one I had arrived with a heart heavier and lighter at the same time, heavy with everything I was leaving behind, light with everything I was going to meet. When the plane landed and I felt the different warmth of the air, that specific warmth that belongs to my land and to no other, I closed my eyes for a moment, just to feel, just to let that moment be exactly what it was, without rush, without the next step, without the list of things to do. My sister Priya was waiting for me in the arrivals hall. When I saw her, she already had tears in her eyes before I had even reached her. That crying that begins before a person wants it to, that comes from the body before it passes through the mind. I let go of my bag and embraced her the way I cannot embrace anyone on a video call, with both arms, feeling her real weight, her real warmth, her real presence. We stayed that way for a time I did not trouble myself to measure. In the months that followed, life rearranged itself in ways I am still learning to inhabit. I helped Priya with the house she was living in, which needed repairs she had been putting off for years for lack of means. I bought a small but mine own apartment in a part of the city I love, with a window that looks out on a busy street, which I stand at in the mornings with coffee in hand, listening to the sounds I learned to love before I learned to miss them. I no longer work as a caregiver, at least not in the way I used to, but I have found that I cannot fully step away from it. There is something in me that was shaped by those 12 years, a way of being close to people, of paying attention, of offering presence, that has become part of who I am. I do voluntary work a few times a week at a local institution. It is different. It is chosen. And that difference changes everything. I think of Harold often, not with the sharp pain of recent grief, but with that gentle longing that remains after time has done its work. I think of the stories he used to tell, of the 4 cups of coffee, of the photograph of him and Dorothy with that smile of people still in the middle of life, of the wooden box with the small key, of the firm handwriting with the subtle tremors of time, in the letter I still keep in the drawer of my bedside table. Sometimes, when I am standing at my window with my morning coffee and the sound of the street comes through the glass, I think of what he wrote in the last line of that letter. "You never let me down, Shanti." And that is rarer than the world recognizes. I never let him down. That is true. But Harold never let me down either. Not when I needed the right word at the right moment. Not when I needed to be reminded that what I did had value. Not when I needed, even without knowing I needed it, someone to truly see me. We saw each other. For 12 years. In shared silences and repeated stories and cups of tea taken side by side, we truly saw each other. And that, I learned, is one of the rarest and most precious things that can happen between two human beings. If there is something I want to leave from this story, it is not the number, not the amount that changed my concrete situation, though I am deeply grateful for it. What I want to leave is this: what you do with genuine care, without an audience, without any guarantee of return, without knowing whether anyone is watching, does not disappear. It stays. It lives on in the people you have touched, and sometimes, in ways you could never have planned or foreseen, it comes back. Take good care of the people beside you, not because you will receive something in return, but because it is the kind of person worth being.